Howdy y'all, welcome back. Today, we are going to be diving right back into the Old World series, where we focus on the oldest and most important cities from around the world, focusing on their histories from before the year 1900 and comparing that to what we see in modern times. In today's video, we have a spectacular little treat. We will be discussing the Old World city of Belfast, the current capital of Northern Ireland. The main focus of this video will be to share with you roughly 150 unique photographs of Belfast, nearly all which were taken between the years 1860 and 1930. Many of these photographs are labeled with the name of the location and what kind of building this is, so I will not be as forward with my narrative discussing each one in particular. For this video, I'd like to let the images do a bit of the speaking for themselves. I will briefly discuss what the current narrative tells us about the ancient history of Belfast, and I will also discuss some articles from BBC News which go into detail about some of the more hidden aspects of Belfast's immense construction. So let us briefly discuss the narrative while we together look through these oldest known images of Belfast, Northern Ireland. Right off the bat, a glaring inconsistency is present. In the brief version of the narrative, we are told that Belfast history begins in the Iron Age, yet as we dive deeper into it, we find evidence that Belfast has actually been occupied by early nomadic tribes since the late Stone Age. Remarkably, it is written that these earliest nomadic tribes of Scotland walked across solid ice during the last ice age to reach Ulster. Here, these early inhabitants are said to have set up what the narrative refers to as small villages. Yet, when we look at the ancient sites across Belfast, we find some that are very odd and quite fitting of the term megalithic. We have Giant's Ring, which dates to roughly 5,000 years ago, a giant earthwork with accompanying stoneworks. And this is near modern Belfast City. We also have the ancient McArt's Fort, situated on Cave Hill, which was constructed at some point during the earliest times of the Iron Age. Belfast is situated where the River Lagan meets the River Farset, in what was deemed to be a swampy marshland and mud-filled terrain. For this reason, the narrative repeatedly mentions that Belfast was, quote, never more than a small village and, quote, never a large community. It's an interesting dichotomy that we see between the earliest inhabitants of the area, the earthworks that they left behind, and what the narrative says about their size and number. That being said, we are told the Gaels entered Belfast roughly before the year 500. And the Gaels either conquered or assimilated with the ancient nomadic tribes of Belfast, depending on which source you read. For the next 600 years or so, Belfast was apparently a melting pot of these two groups, the Gaels and the nomadic tribes, while still remaining a relatively small settlement according to this narrative. That is, until the year 1177 and the Norman invasion of Ireland. Sir John de Courcy acquired the land that included much of eastern Ulster, which itself included the tiny village of Belfast. Of note, and this is just my opinion, I think it's interesting how this apparently tiny village sat at this perfectly strategic spot for so many years. We have groups who literally thrived in these areas for hundreds of years, like the Gaels, and yet we are told it took John de Courcy gaining ownership of this land around 1177 before any official fortifications were ever built here. Upon him gaining these lands, Courcy constructed the castle of Carrickfergus and the castle of Belfast. The Belfast Castle stood for nearly 150 years before the early 1300s, when Robert Bruce attempted to declare himself the King of Scotland. During this time, Robert Bruce sent his brother Edward Bruce to invade Ulster. Edward arrived on the shores of Carrickfergus, only to capture that city and castle before moving forward to Belfast. Belfast Castle was completely destroyed during this time period. A new castle was then built, but with no exact reference as to who built it or when. However, diving back into the historical narrative, this indicates that Gerald, Earl of Kildare, and the wording here is interesting, Gerald then, quote, dismantled Belfast Castle in 1503. The castle was then rebuilt by locals, only to be completely destroyed this time, again by Gerald, Earl of Kildare. The narrative continues onward like this, saying that Belfast Castle has been destroyed and rebuilt many times throughout history. With the Tudor conquest of Ireland in roughly 1552, a new castle was built by James Croft during the reign of Edward VI. This castle was put in the control of British loyalists. However, the British loyalists were quickly expelled by Scottish raiders. Belfast Castle then remained in the hands of the O'Neill clan for many years until a meeting was set up to negotiate for the castle. At this meeting, the O'Neill clan was tricked and captured by British forces who once again overtook Belfast Castle. By 1597, during the 9 Years' War, Belfast Castle was again captured by Ulster rebels. The rebels destroyed the castle entirely. Finally, around the year 1603, Gaelic chieftains, including the O'Neill clan, were now residing in the ruined remains of Belfast Castle. At this point, the chieftains were defeated and the castle was again returned to British control. Britain put Belfast and much of the area of modern Ulster under the control of Arthur Chichester, as Arthur was appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland in 1605. Continuing on with this narrative, by 1611, Chichester ordered masons from Britain to flock to Belfast, and he had over 1 million red bricks fired up and cooked that same year. Belfast Castle was then rebuilt, as well as much of the surrounding city of Belfast. This enormous castle would only remain until April 25th, 1708, when it was destroyed by a massive fire. This was the last known version of Belfast Castle built on the ancient remains where so many previous castles had once stood before. Nowadays, the fortifications for the ancient Belfast Castle lay underneath modern-day High Street and Castle Place, respectively. The Belfast Castle that we see today was not built until 1870. While still being remarkably beautiful and definitely old world, it's hard to imagine that for nearly 165 years, from 1708 until 1870, no castle or defensive fortification stood in Belfast, just the remains of the ancient ruined castle. This narration continues onward, giving us a little bit more jumbled view of the history of Belfast. Repeatedly, as I mentioned earlier, Belfast is stated in this narrative to be quote-unquote insignificant, even going as far as stating that on John Speed's 1610 map of Ireland, he almost did not include Belfast at all. We are told that Belfast truly did not begin to grow until the mid-17th century plantation of Ulster. Initially, when I read that, I wasn't sure how to take it. In this case, apparently the use of the word plantation literally means the idea or concept of taking people from Britain and moving them to Belfast. It is considered to be the organized colonization of Ulster. We are told these British people went willingly to Ulster under King James I. However, when we look at the use of the word plantation in later times and the connotation it had with the ideas of slave labor, it makes me question a bit of this narrative regarding the British and how they developed Belfast. But I digress. Essentially, the history after that is for you to discover. There's a lot more there, and it becomes very convoluted as we stretch forward, especially when we want to focus on these photographs more than this narrative. So I'm gonna chime out on the narrative a bit and just go into these photographs a little bit with you. Because after this, one of the main things that we have that I want to mention here is we have in the 1800s the Great Famine in Ireland, which involved a potato blight, which ruined nearly all the potato crops around the country. What many people might not know is this potato blight, which is a type of mold or fungus that is contagious amongst potatoes, It was actually originated in the Americas and it spread to Ireland. Consequently, this great famine actually led many Irish people to flee Ireland and move to America. So I just found it very weird how these things kind of played out and they played into one another. Also, around this same time period, just like we see in Canada, and I have other videos about Canada that you might enjoy with a lot of old world images, we have a large number of royal buildings that are being constructed in Belfast during the mid-1800s. We have the Queen's Colleges, we have Parliament and government buildings, and most interesting to me in Belfast, we have the advent of advanced shipping docks and ship-making organizations which would go on to greatly shape the future of the world. Mud that was dredged up to create the Victoria Canal was converted into an artificial island for the royalty called Queen's Island, which can be found off the coast of East Belfast. John Hickson, an engineer from Liverpool who worked on Cromack Street and helped in the canal project, decided to use his excess iron ore to try his hand in creating ships. Hickson hired Edward Harland to help on his project, and they launched their first ship in 1855 to much success. Their designs revolutionized shipbuilding. Soon, Harland bought out Hickson's ownership of the company with backing from Gustav Schwab. Schwab's nephew was also hired, his name Gustav Wolff. Together, they formed the Harland and Wolff Ship Company, and with the advent of the American Civil War, Harland and Wolff became one of the largest and most well-known shipbuilding companies in the entire world. All of their creations were coming directly out of Belfast, Northern Ireland. Gustav Schwab, the financier who made all of this possible, would go on to form his own luxury cruise line company called White Star Line in 1869. He ordered every single one of his ocean liners to be made by Harland and Wolff. The White Star Line included RMS Oceanic, HMHS Britannic, RMS Olympic, and most famous of all, RMS Titanic. All of these creations were built on the shores of Belfast. Today, there's a massive museum dedicated to the work of Harland and Wolff, standing at the same height that the Titanic once stood. Another part that was really interesting, at least to me, is on the location where Harland and Wolff used to have their offices is now the location of HBO's Game of Thrones studios. Now, diving back into the current narrative, since this period of success, Belfast has experienced many trials and tribulations throughout the years. I like to keep my videos as positive as possible and focus on the intelligence and the willpower of the previous civilizations. I could break down all of the war and the tragedy within the history of Belfast, but I don't believe that would be fitting for this video or for my content. So instead, I wanted to dive into one of the seldom discussed aspects of the construction of Belfast, that is, the secret river for which the very city of Belfast is named. I'm going to read you a little bit from a BBC News article dated to 2018. Essentially, and why I mentioned it earlier, we have original earthworks, we have the city of Belfast, the castle, all of it being built along the ancient river Farset in Belfast. Why this is worth pointing out and what makes this worth ending the video on is the river Farset is no longer accessible by human beings unless you have a very high level of clearance. Basically, throughout time, the river, which shaped the city, was constructed on top of. At first, it was simply bridges and roads, then buildings and larger structures, before finally the entire river, from start to finish in Belfast, had been covered over by masonry construction. The ancient river apparently still flows beneath Belfast today, unbeknownst to many of the people walking just a few dozen inches above it. So let me give you a brief passage or two from this article, and then we will wrap up the video there. And I quote, "Buried just 60 centimeters beneath the city's modern surface, the long-lost river Farset that gave Belfast its name still flows silently through the heart of Northern Ireland's capital. In fact, Belfast, or Biel Fierste, the sandy ford at the mouth of the Farset in Irish, not only owes its existence to this river, but also its growth and early prosperity. Yet, for the last 170 years, this ancient waterway has been sealed off from the outside world by a series of tunnels and is largely forgotten by those walking just above it. Belfast was founded at a natural crossing point where the little-known Farset flowed into Belfast's centerpiece, the River Lagan. This formed a narrow sandbar at what is now the corner of High Street and Victoria Street. Today, this is the site of the iconic St. George's Church, but the modern building stands on an ancient chapel where more than 800 years ago, pilgrims waiting to ford the mud flats at low tide would pray for a safe river crossing. These days, the invisible river runs parallel to the peace lines that long separated Protestants and Catholics, threads Castle Street and Bank Street, and winds directly under High Street, giving the road its distinctive curve and width. It then flows to the left of the towering Albert Memorial Clock and empties into the Lagan at Donegal Quay." End quote. So there you have it, the ancient and noble city of Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland. For centuries, it was a defensive city, always having a castle, and that castle was repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt throughout time, always having a hidden river flowing beneath it, only to finally be covered over once and for all with the final updates to the city during Victorian times. Belfast is still ripe with ancient old world structures, and yet as we look through the oldest known photographs and compare them with the modern ones, I still feel as though the old world photographs are hiding a bit more than meets the eye. But I think I'm gonna wrap up the video there. I wanted to give a big thanks to everyone who supports the channel, who watches the videos, who hits the like button, and who shares these videos to help get the word out there. And I wanted to give a specific shout out to Michael Cruchley, who is one of the biggest supporters of the channel. I honestly couldn't do this without people like Michael, and I just wanted to say thank you. I also wanted to give a shout out to Logan Roth, Lisa Combs, Bryan Goodlander, Drumstick, and Ronan O'Hanlon. You guys are all great friends, and thank you for supporting the channel. Now, if you want to support me, or if you want to reach out to me and speak to me directly, you can do so on these platforms listed right here. Mainly, let's discuss Belfast in the comments down below. Let me know what information here stood out to you, or what images here interested you the most. I'll be sure to chime in myself in the comments, and I'll favorite some comments that I think are sharing some of the best ideas. Again, I thank you so much for joining me in viewing these 150 old world images of Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I will talk to you very, very soon on the next video.